But his son hated him. He hated him for coming up to them, for stopping and looking down on them. He hated him for interrupting them. He hated him for the exaltation and sublimity of his gestures, for the magnificence of his head, for his exactness and egotism. For there he stood, commanding them to attend to him. But most of all, he hated the twang and twitter of his father's emotion, which, vibrating round them, disturbed the perfect simplicity and good sense of his relations with his mother. By looking fixedly at the page, he hoped to make him move on. By pointing his finger at a word, he hoped to recall his mother's attention, which he knew angrily wavered instantly his father stopped. But no, nothing would make Mr. Ramsay move on. There he stood, demanding sympathy. Mrs. Ramsay, who had been sitting loosely, folding her son in her arm, braced herself, and half-turning seemed to raise herself with an effort, and at once to pour erect into the air a rain of energy, a column of spray, looking at the same time animated and alive, as if all her energies were being fused into force, burning and illuminating quietly, though she sat, taking up her stocking again, and into this delicious fecundity, this fountain and spray of life, the fatal sterility of the male plunged itself like a beak of brass, barren and bare. He wanted sympathy. He was a failure, he said. Mrs. Ramsay flashed her needles. Mr. Ramsay repeated, never taking his eyes from her face, that he was a failure. She blew the words back at him. Charles Tansley, she said. But he must have more than that. It was sympathy he wanted. To be assured of his genius, first of all, and then to be taken within the circle of life, warmed and soothed, to have his senses restored to him, his barrenness made fertile, and all the rooms of the house made full of life, the drawing room, behind the drawing room, the kitchen, above the kitchen, the bedrooms, and beyond them the nurseries. They must be furnished. They must be filled with life. Charles Tansley thought him the greatest metaphysician of the time, she said, but he must have more than that. He must have sympathy. He must be assured that he too lived in the heart of life, was needed. Not here only, but all over the world. Flashing her needles, confident, upright, she created drawing room and kitchen, set them all aglow. Bade him take his ease there, go in and out, enjoy himself. She laughed, she knitted. Standing between her knees, very stiff, James felt all her strength flaring up to be drunk and quenched by the beak of brass, the arid scimitar of the male, which smote mercilessly again and again, demanding sympathy. He was a failure, he repeated. Well, look then, feel then. Flashing her needles, glancing round about her, out of the window, into the room, at James himself, she assured him, beyond a shadow of a doubt, by her laugh, her poise, her competence, as a nurse carrying a light across a dark room assures a fractious child, that it was real. The house was full, the garden blowing. If he put implicit faith in her, nothing should hurt him. However deep he buried himself or climbed high, not for a second should he find himself without her. So boasting of her capacity to surround and protect, there was scarcely a shell of herself left for her to know herself by. All was so lavished and spent, and James, as he stood stiff between her knees, felt her rise in a rosy, flowered fruit tree laid with leaves and dancing boughs, into which the beak of brass, the arid scimitar of his father, the egotistical man, plunged and smote, demanding sympathy. Filled with her words, like a child who drops off satisfied, he said at last, looking at her with humble gratitude, restored, renewed, that he would take a turn, he would watch the children playing cricket. He went. Immediately, Mrs. Ramsay seemed to fold herself together, one petal closed in another, and the whole fabric fell in exhaustion upon itself, so that she had only strength enough to move her finger in exquisite abandonment to exhaustion across the page of Grimm's fairy story, while there throbbed through her, like the pulse in a spring which has expanded to its full width and now gently ceases to beat, the rapture of successful creation. Every throb of this pulse seemed, as he walked away, to enclose her and her husband, to give to each that solace which two different notes, one high, one low, struck together, seemed to give each other as they combined. Yet, as the resonance died and she turned to the fairy tale again, Mrs. Ramsay felt not only exhausted in body afterwards, not at the time, she always felt this, but also there tinged her physical fatigue some faintly disagreeable sensation with another origin. Not that, as she read aloud the story of the fisherman's wife, she knew precisely what it came from, nor did she let herself put into words her dissatisfaction when she realized, at the turn of the page when she stopped and heard dully, ominously, a wave fall, how it came from this. She did not like, even for a second, to feel finer than her husband, and further could not bear not being entirely sure, when she spoke to him, of the truth of what she said. Universities and people wanting him lectures and books, and their being of the highest importance, all that she did not doubt for a moment. But it was their relation and his coming to her like that openly so that anyone could see that discomposed her. For then people said he depended on her, when they must know that of the two he was infinitely the more important, and what she gave the world in comparison with what he gave negligible. But then again, it was the other thing too, not being able to tell him the truth, being afraid, for instance, about the greenhouse roof and the expense it would be, £50 perhaps, to mend it. And then about his books, to be afraid that he might guess what she a little suspected, that his last book was not quite his best book. She gathered that from William Banks. And then to hide small daily things, and the children seeing it, and the burden it laid on them, all this diminished the entire joy, the pure joy of the two notes sounding together, and let the sound die on her ear now with a dismal flatness. A shadow was on the page. She looked up. It was Augustus Carmichael shuffling past, precisely now, at the very moment when it was painful to be reminded of the inadequacy of human relationships, that the most perfect was flawed and could not bear the examination which, loving her husband, with her instinct for truth, she turned upon it, when it was painful to feel herself convicted of unworthiness and impeded in her proper function by these lies, these exaggerations. It was at this moment, when she was fretted thus ignobly in the wake of her exaltation, that Mr. Carmichael shuffled past in his yellow slippers, and some demon in her made it necessary for her to call out as he passed, "Going indoors, Mr. Carmichael." He said nothing. He took opium. The children said he had stained his beard yellow with it. Perhaps what was obvious to her was that the poor man was unhappy. Came to them every year as an escape, and yet every year she felt the same thing. He did not trust her. She said, "I am going to the town. Shall I get you stamps, paper, tobacco?" And she felt him wince. He did not trust her. It was his wife's doing. She remembered that iniquity of his wife's towards him, which had made her turn to steel and adamant there in the horrid little room in St. John's Wood, when with her own eyes she had seen that odious woman turn him out of the house. He was unkempt. He dropped things on his coat. He had the tiresomeness of an old man with nothing in the world to do. And she turned him out of the room. She said in her odious way, "Now, Mrs. Ramsay and I want to have a little talk together." And Mrs. Ramsay could see, as if before her eyes, the innumerable miseries of his life. Had he money enough to buy tobacco? Did he have to ask her for it? Half a crown? 18 pence? Oh, she could not bear to think of the little indignities she made him suffer. And always now, why she could not guess, except that it came probably from that woman somehow, he shrank from her. He never told her anything, but what more could she have done? There was a sunny room given up to him. The children were good to him. Never did she show a sign of not wanting him. She went out of her way, indeed, to be friendly. "Do you want stamps? Do you want tobacco? Here's a book you might like," and so on. And after all, here insensibly she drew herself together, physically, the sense of her own beauty becoming, as it did so seldom, present to her. After all, she had not generally any difficulty in making people like her. For instance, George Manning, Mr. Wallace, famous as they were, they would come to her of an evening quietly and talk alone over her fire. She bore about with her, she could not help knowing it, the torch of her beauty. She carried it erect into any room that she entered. And after all, veil it as she might and shrink from the monotony of bearing that it imposed on her, her beauty was apparent. She had been admired. She had been loved. She had entered rooms where mourners sat. Tears had flown in her presence, men and women too. Letting go the multiplicity of things had allowed themselves with her the relief of simplicity. It injured her that he should shrink. It hurt her. And yet not cleanly, not rightly. That was what she minded, coming as it did on top of her discontent with her husband. The sense she had now when Mr. Carmichael shuffled past, just nodding to her question with a book beneath his arm and his yellow slippers, that she was suspected, and that all this desire of hers to give, to help, was vanity. For her own self-satisfaction was it that she wished so instinctively to help, to give, that people might say of her, "Oh, Mrs. Ramsay, dear Mrs. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, of course, dear Mrs. Ramsay," and need her and send for her and admire her. Was it not secretly this that she wanted, and therefore when Mr. Carmichael shrank away from her, as he did at this moment, making off to some corner where he did acrostics endlessly, she did not feel merely snubbed back in her instinct, but made aware of the pettiness of some part of her and of human relations, how flawed they are, how despicable, how self-seeking at their best, shabby and worn out, and not presumably. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair was white, any longer a sight that filled the eyes with joy. She had better devote her mind to the story of the fisherman and his wife, and so pacify that bundle of sensitiveness. None of her children was as sensitive as he was. Her son James. The man's heart grew heavy, she read aloud, and he would not go. He said to himself, "It is not right," and yet he went, and when he came to the sea, the water was quite purple and dark blue, and gray and thick, and no longer so green and yellow, but it was still quiet. And he stood there and said, Mrs. Ramsay could have wished that her husband had not chosen that moment to stop. Why had he not gone, as he said, to watch the children playing cricket? But he did not speak. He looked, he nodded, he approved. He went on. He slipped, seeing before him that hedge, which had over and over again rounded some pause, signified some conclusion, seeing his wife and child, seeing again the urns with the trailing red geraniums which had so often decorated processes of thought, and bore, written up among their leaves as if they were scraps of paper on which one scribbles notes in the rush of reading. He slipped, seeing all this, smoothly into speculation suggested by an article in the Times about the number of Americans who visit Shakespeare's house every year. If Shakespeare had ever existed, he asked, would the world have differed much from what it is today? Does the progress of civilization depend upon great men? Is the lot of the average human being better now than in the time of the pharaohs? Is the lot of the average human being, however, he asked himself, the criterion by which we judge the measure of civilization? Possibly not. Possibly the greatest good requires the existence of a slave class. The lift man in the tube is an eternal necessity. The thought was distasteful to him. He tossed his head. To avoid it, he would find some way of snubbing the predominance of the arts. He would argue that the world exists for the average human being, that the arts are merely a decoration imposed on the top of human life. They do not express it, nor is Shakespeare necessary to it. Not knowing precisely why it was that he wanted to disparage Shakespeare and come to the rescue of the man who stands eternally in the door of the lift, he picked a leaf sharply from the hedge. All this would have to be dished up for the young men at Cardiff next month, he thought. Here on his terrace, he was merely foraging and picnicking. He threw away the leaf that he had picked, so peevishly, like a man who reaches from his horse to pick a bunch of roses or stuffs his pockets with nuts, as he ambles at his ease through the lanes and fields of a country known to him from boyhood. It was all familiar, this turning, that style, that cut across the fields. Hours he would spend thus with his pipe of an evening, thinking up and down and in and out of the old familiar lanes and commons, which were all stuck about with the history of that campaign there, the life of this statesman here, with poems and with anecdotes, with figures too, this thinker, that soldier. all very brisk and clear, but at length the lane, the field, the common, the fruitful nut tree, and the flowering hedge led him on to that further turn of the road where he dismounted always, tied his horse to a tree, and proceeded on foot alone. He reached the edge of the lawn and looked out on the bay beneath. It was his fate, his peculiarity, whether he wished it or not, to come out thus on a spit of land which the sea is slowly eating away, and there to stand like a desolate seabird alone. It was his power, his gift, suddenly to shed all superfluities, to shrink and diminish, so that he looked barer and felt sparer, even physically, yet lost none of his intensity of mind, and so to stand on his little ledge facing the dark of human ignorance. How we know nothing, and the sea eats away the ground we stand on. That was his fate, his gift. But having thrown away when he dismounted all gestures and fripperies, all trophies of nuts and roses, and shrunk so that not only fame but even his own name was forgotten by him, he kept even in that desolation of vigilance which spared no phantom and luxuriated in no vision. And it was in this guise that he inspired in William Banks intermittently, and in Charles Tansley obsequiously, and in his wife now when she looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the lawn, profoundly, reverence and pity and gratitude too, as a stake driven into the bed of a channel upon which the gulls perch and the waves beat inspires in merry boatloads of feeling of gratitude for the duty it has taken upon itself of marking the channel out there in the floods alone. But the father of 8 children has no choice, muttering half aloud, so he broke off, turned aside, raised his eyes, sought the figure of his wife reading stories to his little boy, filled his pipe. He turned from the sight of human ignorance and human fate and the sea eating the ground we stand on, which, had he been able to contemplate it fixedly, might have led to something, and found consolation in trifles so slight compared with the august theme just now before him that he was disposed to slur that comfort over, to deprecate it, as if to be caught happy in a world of misery was for an honest man the most despicable of crimes. It was true, he was for the most part happy. He had his wife, he had his children, he had promised in 6 weeks' time to talk some nonsense to the young men of Cardiff about Locke, Hume, Berkeley, and the causes of the French Revolution. But this and his pleasure in it, his glory in the phrases he made, and the ardor of youth, and his wife's beauty, and the tributes that reached him from Swansea, Cardiff, Exeter, Southampton, Kidderminster, Oxford, Cambridge, all had to be deprecated and concealed under the phrase talking nonsense. Because in effect he had not done the thing he might have done. It was a disguise. It was the refuge of a man afraid to his own feelings, who could not say, this is what I like, this is what I am, and rather pitiable and distasteful to William Banks and Lily Briscoe, who wondered why such concealment should be necessary, why he needed always praise, why so brave a man in thought should be so timid in life, how strangely he was venerable and laughable at one and the same time. Teaching and preaching is beyond human power, Lily suspected. She was putting away her things. If you are exalted, you must somehow come a cropper. Mrs. Ramsay gave him what he asked too easily. Then the change must be so upsetting, Lily said. He comes in from his books and finds us all playing games and talking nonsense. Imagine what a change from the things he thinks about, she said. He was bearing down upon them. Now he stopped dead and stood looking in silence at the sea. Now he had turned away again. Yes, Mr. Banks said, watching him go, it was 1,000 pities. Lily had said something about his frightening her. He changed from one mood to another so suddenly. Yes, said Mr. Banks, it was 1,000 pities that Ramsay could not behave a little more like other people, for he liked Lily Briscoe. He could discuss Ramsay with her quite openly. It was for that reason, he said, that the young don't read Carlyle. A crusty old grumbler who lost his temper if the porridge was cold. Why should he preach to us? Was what Mr. Banks understood that young people said nowadays? There was 1,000 pities if you thought as he did that Carlyle was one of the great teachers of mankind. Lily was ashamed to say that she had not read Carlyle since she was at school. But in her opinion, one liked Mr. Ramsay all the better for thinking that if his little finger ached, the whole world must come to an end. It was not that she minded, for who could be deceived by him? He asked you quite openly to flatter him, to admire him. His little dodges received nobody. What she disliked was his narrowness, his blindness, she said, looking after him. A bit of a hypocrite, Mr. Banks suggested, looking too at Mr. Ramsay's back, for was he not thinking of his friendship and of Cam refusing to give him a flower, and of all those boys and girls in his own house full of comfort, but since his wife's death, quite rather. Of course he had his work, all the same. He rather wished Lily to agree that Ramsay was, as he said, a bit of a hypocrite. Lily Briscoe went on putting away her brushes, looking up, looking down, looking up. There he was, Mr. Ramsay, advancing towards them, swinging, careless, oblivious, remote. A bit of a hypocrite, she repeated. Oh no, the most sincere of men, the truest, here he was, the best. But looking down, she thought, he is absorbed in himself. He is tyrannical, he is unjust. And kept looking down purposely, for only so she could keep steady, staying with the Ramsays. Directly one looked up and saw them, what she called being in love flooded them. They became part of that unreal but penetrating and exciting universe which is the world seen through the eyes of love. The sky stuck to them, the birds sang through them, and what was even more exciting, she felt, too, as she saw Mr. Ramsay bearing down and retreating, and Mrs. Ramsay sitting with James in the window and the cloud moving and the tree bending, how life, from being made up of little separate incidents, which one lived one by one, became curled and whole like a wave which bore one up with it and threw one down with it, there with a dash on the beach. Mr. Banks expected her to answer, and she was about to say something criticizing Mrs. Ramsay, how she was alarming too, in her way, high-handed, or words to that effect, when Mr. Banks made it entirely unnecessary for her to speak by his rapture. For such it was considering his age, turned 60, and his cleanliness and his impersonality, and the white scientific coat which seemed to clothe him. For him to gaze as Lily saw him gazing at Mrs. Ramsay was a rapture equivalent, Lily felt, to the loves of dozens of young men. And perhaps Mrs. Ramsay had never excited the loves of dozens of young men. It was love, she thought, pretending to move her canvas, distilled and filtered. Love that never attempted to clutch its object, but like the love which mathematicians bear their symbols, or poets their phrases, was meant to be spread over the world and become part of the human gain. So it was indeed. The world, by all means, should have shared it. Could Mr. Banks have said why that woman pleased him so? Why the sight of her reading a fairy tale to her boy had upon him precisely the same effect as the solution of a scientific problem. So that he rested in contemplation of it, and felt as he felt when he had proved something absolute about the digestive system of plants. That barbarity was tamed, the reign of chaos subdued. Such a rapture, for by what other name could one call it, made Lily Briscoe forget entirely what she had been about to say. It was nothing of importance, something about Mrs. Ramsay. It paled beside this rapture, this silent stare for which she felt intense gratitude. For nothing so solaced her, eased her of the perplexity of life, and miraculously raised its burdens as this sublime power, this heavenly gift, and one would no more disturb it while it lasted than break up the shaft of sunlight lying level across the floor. That people should love like this, that Mr. Banks should feel this for Mrs. Ramsay, she glanced at him musing, was helpful, was exalting. She wiped one brush after another upon a piece of old rag, menially on purpose. She took shelter from the reverence which covered all women. She felt herself praised. Let him gaze. She would steal a look at her picture. She could have wept. It was bad. It was bad. It was infinitely bad. She could have done it differently, of course. The color could have been thinned and faded, the shapes etherealized. That was how Ponce Fort would have seen it. But then she did not see it like that. She saw the color burning on a framework of steel, the light of a butterfly's wing lying upon the arches of a cathedral. Of all that, only a few random marks scrawled upon the canvas remained, and it would never be seen, never be hung even. And there was Mr. Tansley whispering in her ear, "Women can't paint. Women can't write." She now remembered what she had been going to say about Mrs. Ramsay. She did not know how she would have put it, but it would have been something critical. She had been annoyed the other night by some high-handedness. Looking along the level of Mr. Banks' glance at her, she thought that no woman could worship another woman in the way he worshipped. They could only seek shelter under the shade which Mr. Banks extended over them both. Looking along his beam, she added to it her different ray, thinking that she was unquestionably the loveliest of people, bowed over her book. The best, perhaps, but also different, too, from the perfect shape which one saw there. But why different, and how different, she asked herself, scraping her palette of all those mounds of blue and green which seemed to her like clods with no life in them now. Yet she vowed she would inspire them, force them to move, flow, do her bidding tomorrow. How did she differ? What was the spirit in her? The essential thing by which, had you found a crumpled glove in the corner of a sofa, you would have known it from its twisted finger. Hers indisputably. She was like a bird for speed, an arrow for directness. She was willful. She was commanding. Of course, Lily reminded herself, I am thinking of her relations with women, and I am much younger, an insignificant person living off the Brompton Road. She opened bedroom windows, she shut doors. So she tried to start the tune of Mrs. Ramsay in her head. So she tried to start the tune of Mrs. Ramsay in her head. arriving late at night with a light tap on one's bedroom door. Wrapped in an old fur coat, for the setting of her beauty was always that, hasty but apt. She would enact again whatever it might be, Charles Tansley losing his umbrella. Mr. Carmichael snuffling and sniffing. Mr. Banks saying the vegetable salts are lost. All this she would adroitly shape, even maliciously twist. And moving over to the window in pretense that she must go, it was dawn. She could see the sun rising. Half turned back more intimately, but still always laughing, insists that she must, Minta must, they all must marry. Since in the whole world whatever laurels might be tossed to her, but Mrs. Ramsay cared not a fig for her painting. Or triumphs won by her, probably Mrs. Ramsay had had her share of those. And here she saddened, darkened, and came back to her chair. There could be no disputing this. An unmarried woman, she lightly took her hand for a moment. An unmarried woman has missed the best of life. The house seemed full of children sleeping and Mrs. Ramsay listening. Shaded lights and regular breathing. Oh, but Lily would say there was her father, her home, even had she dared to say it, her painting, but all this seemed so little, so virginal against the other. Yet as the night wore on, and white lights parted the curtains, and even now and then some bird chirped in the garden, gathering a desperate courage, she would urge her own exemption from the universal law, plead for it. She liked to be alone, she liked to be herself, she was not made for that. And so have to meet a serious stare from eyes of unparalleled depth, and confront Mrs. Ramsay's simple certainty. And she was childlike now, that her dear Lily, her little Brisk, was a fool. Then she remembered she had laid her head on Mrs. Ramsay's lap and laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed, almost hysterically at the thought of Mrs. Ramsay presiding with immutable calm over destinies which she completely failed to understand. There she sat, simple, serious. She had recovered her sense of her now. This was the glove's twisted finger. But into what sanctuary had one penetrated? Lily Briscoe had looked up at last. And there was Mrs. Ramsay, unwitting entirely what had caused her laughter, still presiding, but now with every trace of willfulness abolished, and in its stead something clear as the space which the clouds at last uncover. The little space of sky which sleeps beside the moon. Was it wisdom? Was it knowledge? Was it once more the deceptiveness of beauty, so that all one's perceptions halfway to truth were tangled in a golden mesh? Or did she lock up within her some secret which certainly Lily Briscoe believed people must have for the world to go on at all? Everyone could not be as helter-skelter, hand-to-mouth as she was, but if they knew, could they tell one what they knew? Sitting on the floor with her arms round Mrs. Ramsay's knees, close as she could get, smiling to think that Mrs. Ramsay would never know the reason of that pressure. She imagined how in the chambers of the mind and heart of the woman who was physically touching her were stood like the treasures in the tombs of kings, tablets bearing sacred inscriptions, which if one could spell them out would teach one everything. But they would never be offered openly, never made public. What art was there known to love or cunning by which one pressed through into those secret chambers? What device for becoming like waters poured into one jar, inextricably the same, one with the object one adored? Could the body achieve, or the mind, subtly mingling in the intricate passages of the brain or the heart? Could loving, as people called it, make her and Mrs. Ramsay one? For it was not knowledge but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge, she had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsay's knee. Nothing happened. Nothing. As she leant her head against Mrs. Ramsay's knee, and yet she knew knowledge and wisdom were stored up in Mrs. Ramsay's heart. How then, she had asked herself, did one know one thing or another thing about people sealed as they were? Only like a bee, drawn by some sweetness or sharpness in the air, intangible to touch or taste, one haunted the dome-shaped hive, ranged the wastes of the air over the countries of the world alone, and then haunted the hives with their murmurs and their stirrings. The hives which were people. Mrs. Ramsay rose, Lily rose, Mrs. Ramsay went. For days there hung about her, as after a dream, some subtle change is felt in the person one has dreamt of. More vividly than anything she said, the sound of murmuring, and as she sat in the wicker armchair in the drawing-room window, she wore, to Lily's eyes, an august shape, the shape of a dome. This ray passed level with Mr. Banks' ray, straight to Mrs. Ramsay, sitting reading there with James at her knee. But now, while she still looked, Mr. Banks had done. He had put on his spectacles. He had stepped back. He had raised his hand. He had slightly narrowed his clear blue eyes when Lily, rousing herself, saw what he was at and winced like a dog who sees a hand raised to strike it. She would have snatched her picture off the easel, but she said to herself, "One must." She braced herself to stand the awful trial of someone looking at her picture. "One must," she said, "one must. And if it must be seen, Mr. Banks was less alarming than another." But that any other eyes should see the residue of her 33 years, the deposit of each day's living mixed with something more secret than she had ever spoken or shown in the course of all those days, was an agony. At the same time, it was immensely exciting. Nothing could be cooler and quieter. Taking out a penknife, Mr. Banks tapped the canvas with the bone handle. What did she wish to indicate by the triangular purple shape just there, he asked. It was Mrs. Ramsay reading to James, she said. She knew his objection, that no one could tell it for a human shape. But she had made no attempt at likeness, she said. But she had made no attempt at likeness. For what reason had she introduced them then? He asked. Why indeed, except that if there in that corner it was bright, here in this she felt the need of darkness. Simple, obvious, commonplace as it was, Mr. Banks was interested. Mother and child, then objects of universal veneration, and in this case the mother was famous for her beauty, might be reduced, he pondered, to a purple shadow without irreverence. But the picture was not of them, she said, or not in his sense. There were other senses, too, in which one might reverence them. By a shadow here and a light there, for instance, her tribute took that form if, as she vaguely supposed, a picture must be a tribute. A mother and child might be reduced to a shadow without irreverence. A light here required a shadow there, he considered. He was interested. He took it scientifically in complete good faith. The truth was that all his prejudices were on the other side, he explained. The largest picture in his drawing room, which painters had praised and valued at a higher price than he had given for it, was of the cherry trees in blossom on the banks of the Kinnet. He had spent his honeymoon on the banks of the Kinnet, he said. Lily must come and see that picture, he said, but now he turned, with his glasses raised, to the scientific examination of her canvas. The question being one of the relations of masses of lights and shadows, which, to be honest, he had never considered before. He would like to have it explained. What, then, did she wish to make of it? And he indicated the scene before them. She looked. She could not show him what she wished to make of it, could not see it even herself without a brush in her hand. She took up once more her old painting position with the dim eyes and the absent-minded manner, subduing all her impressions as a woman to something much more general, becoming once more under the power of that vision which she had seen clearly once and must now grope for among hedges and houses, and mothers and children, her picture. It was a question she remembered how to connect this mass on the right hand with that on the left. She might do it by bringing the line of the branch across so, or break the vacancy in the foreground by an object. James, perhaps, so. But the danger was that by doing that, the unity of the whole might be broken. She stopped. She did not want to bore him. She took the canvas lightly off the easel. But it had been seen, it had been taken from her. This man had shared with her something profoundly intimate, and thanking Mr. Ramsay for it, and Mrs. Ramsay for it, in the hour and the place, crediting the world with a power which she had not suspected, that one could walk away down that long gallery not alone anymore, but arm in arm with somebody, the strangest feeling in the world and the most exhilarating. She nicked the catch of her paint box, too, more firmly than was necessary, and the nick seemed to surround in a circle forever the paint box. The lawn, Mr. Banks, and that wild villain, Cam, dashing past. For Cam grazed the easel by an inch. She would not stop for Mr. Banks and Lily Briscoe, though Mr. Banks, who would have liked a daughter of his own, held out his hand. She would not stop for her father, whom she grazed also by an inch, nor for her mother, who called, "Cam, I want you a moment," as she dashed past. She was off like a bird, bullet or arrow, impelled by what desire, shot by whom, at what directed, who could say? What? Mrs. Ramsay pondered, watching her. It might be a vision of a shell, of a wheelbarrow, of a fairy kingdom on the far side of the hedge. Or it might be the glory of speed, no one knew. But when Mrs. Ramsay called Cam a second time, the projectile dropped in mid-career, and Cam came lagging back, pulling a leaf by the way, to her mother.